For 50 years, these two bands have been filed in the same drawer. Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. British rock. Turn it up. That's the whole analysis. And it's lazy. It was lazy when people were doing it in 1972, and it's still lazy now. Because if you actually listen to these bands, not just recognizing that they're loud, they are doing completely different things, and they always were. Now, this is a Deep Purple channel, so I'll be transparent about where I'm standing. My bias is Purple. I spent a lot of time with the music of this band, and I think they are underrated relative to Zeppelin in most conversations that happen online. But this video isn't going to declare a winner, because that's not actually the interesting question. The interesting question is, what does this comparison reveal about each band when you make it properly? I think the answer is worth hearing, especially if you're new to one or both of these bands and you're trying to figure out what you're actually listening to. The grouping makes superficial sense. Both bands formed in England in the late 60s. Both played loud, distorted rock at a time when that wasn't the mainstream. Both are routinely placed in the holy trinity of heavy rock alongside Black Sabbath, though that framing flattens all three bands. The timeline overlaps almost perfectly. Deep Purple formed in 1968. Led Zeppelin also formed in 68. They were operating in the same market, the same clubs, the same music press. The comparison wasn't invented by the internet. It was happening while both these bands were still active. And there's a specific moment that crystallizes how these two bands saw each other. Ritchie Blackmore and John Bonham were drinking at the Rainbow in Los Angeles. Bonham started in on Smoke on the Water. He said, "It must be really hard to stand there and go, der, der, der." Blackmore came back with Whole Lot of Love, the riff. "Yeah, it's nearly as difficult as going, der, 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 der. At least we don't copy anybody." Bonham fired back. They went back and forth about influence and theft, Hendrix, Muddy Waters, the whole thing. And then, according to Blackmore, they ended up in the bathroom, both of them quietly admitting they hadn't meant any of it. "There's room at the top for everybody," Bonham said, and they went back downstairs and kept on drinking. That story is everything. Competitive, mutual, a little petty, and ultimately respect. That's the actual relationship between these two bands. Roger Glover has been even more generous on record. In an interview, he said that before Purple, he thought heavy music was just about having more equipment and playing louder. Then he heard Led Zeppelin, specifically Dazed and Confused, and How Many More Times, and realized that heavy wasn't about big, loud. It was about attitude. That was the key. And then Deep Purple came along. He said that understanding shaped where he was going as a musician. So the bands respected each other. The comparison is legitimate. The problem is that it usually stops there. Two loud British bands, roughly contemporary, pick a side. That's not analysis. That's a poll. Let's talk about what each band actually is. Deep Purple, at their core, are a band built around a specific creative tension. Ritchie Blackmore's guitar against John Lord's Hammond organ. That's not incidental. Lord described it in a 1994 interview as deliberately seeking a synthesis of organ and guitar. He called it a gorgon. From 1970s in rock onwards, that's the engine. Lord's background was in classical music. Bach's harmonic sequences and the modal languages of English romantics like Elgar, Holst, and Vaughan Williams were direct influences on how he wrote and arranged. That's not decoration, that's the architecture. Blackmore, for his part, was explicit that the guitar solo on Highway Star was partly structured around Bach. He even worked it out at home before recording, which he almost never did. Nearly every other solo he played in the studio was improvised on the spot. The result is a band with jazz-like improvisational values, but with a classical harmonic vocabulary. When they hit it right, in rock, Machine Head, Made in Japan, they sound like nothing else from that era. The argument isn't that they were the heaviest band. The argument is that they were probably the most structurally sophisticated band playing at that volume. Their live approach matches this. The set had defined improvisational sections. The Blackmore Lord battle was the centerpiece of every show, but it wasn't freeform sprawl, so there was shape even in the improvisation. Led Zeppelin's compositional center is completely different. Jimmy Page is a blues man and an arranger. The band's roots are in American blues, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, and that's documented, so this isn't interpretation. Willie Dixon sued over Whole Lotta Love, settling out of court. The Lemon Song borrows heavily from Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor. The blues has always been transmitted through imitation and transformation. What Page did was transform those sources into something with its own identity. The question of how much credit is due is legitimate, but it doesn't erase what the band became. Beyond the blues, Led Zeppelin did something Deep Purple never seriously attempted. They diversified in real time. Going to California is essentially a folk song. Kashmir, which Plant called Perfect Zeppelin, combines Page's D-A-D-G-A-D tuning, Bonham's march rhythm, and a Middle Eastern atmosphere drawn from Plant's drive through Morocco. The Battle of Evermore is Appalachian folk. These aren't detours, they're actually central to what Zeppelin was. Their live philosophy was radically open-ended. No fixed set lists, no time limits. Songs could run 25 or 35 minutes. The 1973 Madison Square Garden shows have Dazed and Confused expanding into something almost structureless. For some people, that's transcendence. For others, it's indulgence. Okay, now talking about where they overlap, the overlap is real and worth acknowledging. Both bands were operating at the intersection of blues-derived rock and something more ambitious. Both were pushing volume as an expressive tool, not just a performance one. Both came up listening to the same things: Hendrix, Cream, the Yardbirds, Vanilla Fudge. Both bands were also poorly received by the American rock press during most of their peak years. Lester Bangs reviewed Led Zeppelin III in Rolling Stone in November 1970 and reached for the phrase insensitive grossness. He reviewed Machine Head in May 1972 and called Deep Purple prime contenders among the most searingly loud and heavy bands on both sides of the Atlantic. But he'd already called the concerto an atrocity 2 years earlier. So the gatekeepers didn't like either of them. That shared experience of being dismissed partly explains why both bands have a defiant edge in how their fans talk about them 50 years later. And in terms of mutual respect, Roger Glover credits Zeppelin as one of the things that taught him what heavy actually meant. Jimmy Page, in a 2016 Oxford University interview, admitted that in terms of pure live improvisation and the live concert arena, Blackmore was essentially in a league of his own, stating, "I couldn't touch that guy in the live concert arena." This was not a hostile rivalry. It was two bands watching each other and taking notes. So, looking at where they are genuinely different, this is where it really gets specific. Looking at the compositional philosophy, Zeppelin built songs as journeys. They started somewhere and move. Stairway to Heaven is an obvious example. A quiet acoustic opening, extended build, electric climax, and resolution. Even Whole Lotta Love is structured around contrast. The unnerving, quiet middle section, and then the explosion back into the riff. Deep Purple typically built songs as engines. Highway Star, Burn, Smoke on the Water. They establish what they are in the first 8 bars and then refine that thing for the rest of the track. Less transformation, more intensification. Diversity versus coherence. Zeppelin's range was genuinely wider. Folk, blues, world music, hard rock, psychedelia. They moved between registers in ways that kept critics and fans off balance across albums. Deep Purple, at their peak, made a virtue of consistency, despite a broader list of ingredients. If you put on In Rock, you know exactly what you're getting in 30 seconds. The trade-off is that Purple at their most formulaic sound a little familiar. Zeppelin at their most indulgent sounds like an afterthought. And look, we have to look at the keyboard dimension. This is the structural difference most people miss. Deep Purple had a Hammond organ as a lead instrument. That's not the same as having a keyboardist who occasionally adds atmosphere. John Lord was Blackmore's equal in arrangement. John Paul Jones is a brilliant musician, but in Zeppelin's architecture, the guitar and the voice are primary. The bass and the keys fill roles. That difference shapes everything about how both bands sound when they're playing at full weight. Led Zeppelin 4 has sold approximately 36.8 million copies in pure album sales. Machine Head has sold approximately 9 million. That's not a close contest. Stairway to Heaven was being broadcast on FM radio over 3 million times as of the year 2000, and it is the biggest selling single piece of sheet music in rock history. Purple have had big hits, but they have no equivalent singular cultural moment at that scale. Part of that was structural. Zeppelin controlled their catalog, built an album buying mystique, managed the brand, and had Peter Grant as a manager. Part of it was simply that Zeppelin songs reached more people, particularly in North America. Possibly because it's, I don't like to say an easier listen, but there's a difference. Not a conspiracy against Purple. Okay, looking at live performances, you could see this everywhere on Reddit, fan forums, and the bands themselves consistently identify that this is Purple's strongest card. The consensus, close to universal, is that Deep Purple live were more powerful and more consistent than Led Zeppelin live. Page was inconsistent on stage. That's documented by critics and acknowledged by a portion of Zeppelin's own fan base. Blackmore was not inconsistent. Made in Japan is the evidence. It doesn't require an argument, it just requires listening. Okay, so let's look at what each band does better than the other. What Zeppelin does better? Accessible songwriting range. The diversity of the catalog is genuinely impressive. Black Dog, Gallows Pole, No Quarter, The Immigrant Song, Kashmir. These are not variations on the same idea. They are different ideas. If range of expression across a discography is the metric, Zeppelin wins. Part of what made that range commercially powerful is that it was more repeatable. A bar band could learn Whole Lotta Love in an afternoon. That participatory quality, the ability of ordinary musicians to engage with the music at a playing level, not just a listening level, multiplied the points of contact between Zeppelin songs and new audiences in a way Deep Purple's best material simply couldn't. You could not approximate Child in Time in a bar. You could not fake that Blackmore-Lord dynamic with two competent musicians on a Tuesday night. That relative inaccessibility is part of what makes Deep Purple's peak material extraordinary. It was also part of why fewer people found their way to it. Looking at production, Jimmy Page as a producer shaped those recordings into something more crafted than most of Deep Purple's studio output. Led Zeppelin 4 sounds like a finished object. Machine Head sounds like the Rolling Stones mobile unit parked outside a hotel in Switzerland, which is exactly what it was. Both are valuable, but they're not the same thing. What Deep Purple does better? Live performance. The evidence is made in Japan. That is the argument in 90 minutes. You could also make the negative case. Page's documented live inconsistency against Blackmore's precision, but you don't need the negative case when the positive case is that strong. Ensemble composition, the creative process created something genuinely new. 5 musicians jamming with 2 lead instruments of equal weight, fighting for space and finding it together. There's no equivalent with Led Zeppelin. Jones is outstanding, but he's not John Lord's structural equal in the arrangement. The 5-piece versus 4-piece difference is significant. And endurance. Deep Purple are still making records. Led Zeppelin ended in 1980 when John Bonham died, and they have not reformed for a full tour in the decades since. A band that keeps working accumulates a different kind of evidence than one frozen at its peak. So in closing, Here's what this comparison actually reveals when you make it honestly. Led Zeppelin had a larger, rambling vision. Deep Purple executed their more focused vision. That is not a knock on either band. A larger vision that sometimes falls apart in service of exploration is a legitimate artistic position. A tighter vision that delivers at a high level every time you engage with it is also a legitimate artistic position. The mistake is treating them as the same kind of band and asking which one wins, as if they're competing for the same thing. What the comparison exposes is a fault line in how we talk about heavy rock from this era at all. British hard rock is a genre label that describes almost nothing about these two bands and what they were doing. Zeppelin were transforming blues rock outward. Purple were intensifying rock and drilling down. Both approaches produced masterpieces. They happened to peak at the same time, in the same country, and at the same volume. The reason the conversation has always been too shallow is that people jump straight to the member-by-member comparison. Plant versus Gillan, Page versus Blackmore, Bonham versus Pace, and never stop to ask what both bands were actually trying to do. Page was trying to make records that sounded like nothing else, even if some of the many sources were borrowed. Purple were trying to make a hybrid sound out of 5 musicians. These were different projects. Comparing them directly is like comparing a novelist to a playwright and asking which one is better at sentences. This channel exists because Deep Purple are genuinely underrated, not just relative to Led Zeppelin, but in the larger cultural conversation about what rock music did between 1968 and 1976 and onward. If you have spent the last few minutes here and have never heard Made in Japan, that's where to go next. Not because it beats anything Zeppelin did, but because it is the thing Deep Purple uniquely did better than anyone. They played live with a precision and an intensity that has never been equaled at that weight class. And they had the good sense and luck to record it properly. So that is the case for Deep Purple. Not that they beat Zeppelin, they do something entirely different, something specific, and that specific thing is exceptional. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe. Have a great day.